I treated him like a backpacker, not knowing he was the millionaire owner of the hotel. What I found out changed everything. My name is Madison Thompson, and this is the story of how I discovered that my entire life was built on lies and blood. You know that feeling when you think you have everything figured out, when you're so confident in your little corner of the world that you can't imagine anything ever changing. That was me, 5 years ago, standing behind the polished marble reception desk of Miami's most exclusive hotel, wearing my perfectly tailored blazer-like armor. I was 28 and proud as hell of what I'd accomplished. General manager of the Grandview Miami. Not just any hotel, but the hotel where celebrities stayed, where business deals worth millions were made over champagne brunches, where people like me weren't supposed to exist. But there I was, and I'd earned every damn inch of that position. Or so I thought. The morning of September 15th started like any other. The lobby smelled of imported jasmine from the fresh arrangements that cost more than most people's rent. The sound of Louboutin heels clicking against Italian marble created this symphony of success that I'd grown to love. Everything was perfect, controlled exactly as it should be. I remember adjusting my name tag, Madison Thompson, general manager, and feeling that familiar surge of satisfaction. My father would have been so proud. God rest his soul. Robert Thompson raised me to believe that hard work and determination could get you anywhere. What he never told me was how he'd paved my way with other people's blood. The staff respected me. The guests trusted my recommendations. I had this reputation for maintaining the highest standards, for knowing exactly who belonged in our world and who didn't. I was the gatekeeper, and I took that responsibility seriously. Maybe too seriously. It was around 2 p.m. when he walked in. I still remember every detail about that moment, because it changed the trajectory of my entire existence. The automatic doors slid open with their usual whisper, and in walked this guy who couldn't have looked more out of place if he'd tried. Faded jeans, worn sneakers, a backpack that had seen better days slung over his shoulder. His hair was a little too long, a little too messy, and he had this casual confidence that immediately rubbed me the wrong way. He approached my desk with this easy smile, like he belonged here, like he had every right to walk into my pristine world and disrupt the carefully maintained order I'd spent years perfecting. "Good afternoon," he said, and his voice was warm, friendly even. I was hoping to get a room for tonight. I looked him up and down, taking in every detail of his inappropriate attire, and I felt this familiar protective instinct kick in. This was my domain. These were my standards, and this man, whoever he was, did not meet them. "Do you have a reservation, sir?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Our reservation system was booked solid for months in advance, and this guy definitely wasn't on any list I'd ever seen. "No, I don't. I know it's last minute, but I was hoping you might have something available." He leaned against the counter slightly, and I caught a whiff of, what was that? Sunscreen? Salt air? Like he'd been spending time at some public beach instead of working at a proper job. I straightened my shoulders and gave him my most professional smile, the one that was polite but firm, the one that had turned away countless people who thought they could just walk into the Grandview without proper credentials. "I'm terribly sorry, sir, but we're completely booked additionally." I paused, choosing my words carefully. This establishment caters to a very specific clientele. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at one of the hotels closer to the beach. There are several budget-friendly options that might better suit your profile." The words came out smooth as silk, wrapped in that tone of practiced courtesy that made rejection sound like helpful advice. I'd perfected this speech over the years, and I delivered it with the confidence of someone who knew she was protecting something valuable. Something flickered across his face. Hurt, maybe, disappointment. But then he just smiled again. This sad, knowing smile that made my stomach twist in a way I didn't understand. "I see," he said quietly. "Thank you for your time, Miss Thompson." He knew my name. I noticed that, but I was too caught up in my sense of victory to think about why a random backpacker would bother reading my name tag so carefully. He turned and walked away, and I watched him go with this satisfaction burning in my chest. Another successful interaction, another threat to our standards neutralized. I actually felt proud of myself. Can you believe that? Standing there in my expensive suit, in my marble palace, I felt like I'd just done something noble, like I'd protected the integrity of everything I'd worked so hard to build. The other staff members had witnessed the exchange, and I caught a few approving nods. Sarah from concierge gave me a little smile. Even Mr. Peterson, our head of security, seemed pleased with how I'd handled the situation. In that moment, I felt vindicated, justified, absolutely certain that I'd done the right thing. God, I was such a fool. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of routine tasks. I handled 3 VIP check-ins, resolved a complaint about room service timing, and reviewed the evening's dinner reservations. Normal stuff, the kind of work that made me feel important, needed, successful. Every now and then, I'd catch myself thinking about the backpacker and feeling this little glow of satisfaction. I had no idea that in 3 days, everything I thought I knew about my life would come crashing down around me. I had no idea that the man I'd just dismissed with such casual cruelty held the power to destroy everything I'd built. I had no idea that my father's sins were about to catch up with me in the most devastating way possible. But most of all, I had no idea that the stranger I'd just turned away would become the most important person in my life, and that before this was all over, I'd have to choose between everything I thought I wanted and everything I never knew I needed. That night, I went home to my perfectly appointed apartment, poured myself a glass of wine, and thought about what a good day it had been. I was Madison Thompson, general manager of the Grandview Miami, and I was exactly where I belonged. The irony is almost funny now. Almost. 3 days. That's all it took for my perfectly constructed world to implode. I walked into the monthly board meeting that Tuesday morning with the same confidence I'd carried for 5 years. My heels clicked against the marble floor in that familiar rhythm of success. My portfolio clutched in my manicured hands, ready to present another month of stellar performance numbers. The Grandview's conference room was my stage, and I knew my lines by heart. The mahogany table gleamed under the crystal chandelier. Surrounded by the usual faces, department heads, senior staff, a few executives from corporate, I took my seat at the table like I had dozens of times before, completely unaware that I was about to experience the most humiliating moment of my entire life. "Ladies and gentlemen," began Patricia Walsh, our regional director, "before we dive into the monthly reports, I'd like to introduce someone very special who's been observing our operations over the past few days." My stomach did this weird little flip, but I couldn't figure out why. Maybe it was intuition. Maybe some part of me already knew what was coming. Please welcome Alexander Harrison, heir to the Harrison Hotel Group and future CEO of our parent company. The blood drained from my face so fast I thought I might faint. Alexander Harrison, the backpacker, the man I'd dismissed 3 days ago with such casual cruelty, was sitting at the head of our conference table, wearing an impeccably tailored suit that probably cost more than my monthly salary. Our eyes met across the polished wood, and I saw something there. Not anger, not vindictiveness, just this deep, profound sadness that made my chest tight. He looked exactly the same and completely different all at once. The messy hair was now perfectly styled. The casual confidence had transformed into quiet authority. But those eyes held the same gentle disappointment I'd seen when I'd turned him away. "Mr. Harrison has been conducting anonymous evaluations of our properties," Patricia continued, her voice cutting through the roaring in my ears. "As part of his preparation to take over the company, he wanted to experience our hotels from a guest's perspective." I couldn't breathe. The room felt like it was spinning, and all I could think about was my voice saying those awful words. "This establishment caters to a very specific clientele, and perhaps you'd be more comfortable at one of the budget-friendly options." Oh God. Oh God. Oh God. Oh God. Alexander stood up slowly, and when he spoke, his voice was calm, professional, devastating. "I've had the opportunity to visit all 12 of our flagship properties over the past month. Most of the experiences were enlightening." His eyes found mine again, and I wanted to disappear into the floor. However, I did encounter one particularly memorable interaction here at the Grandview Miami that I feel warrants discussion. The humiliation was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It started as this burning sensation in my cheeks and spread through my entire body like liquid fire. Every person in that room was staring at me, and I could see the realization dawning on their faces as they connected the dots. Sarah from concierge was looking at me with this mixture of horror and pity. Mr. Peterson had gone completely pale. Even Patricia, who'd always been my strongest supporter, was staring at me like she'd never seen me before. "Miss Thompson," Alexander said, and hearing my name and his voice made me want to crawl under the table. "Would you care to explain your hotel's policy regarding guest profiles?" I opened my mouth, but no words came out. What could I say? How do you explain away that level of prejudice and cruelty? How do you apologize for judging someone so completely wrong? I thought, I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. I was protecting the hotel's reputation, I thought. You thought what, exactly? His tone wasn't cruel, but it was relentless. That someone's appearance determines their worth, that the clothes they wear define their character. The worst part was that he was right. Every word he said was absolutely, devastatingly correct, and I had no defense. I'd been so proud of my ability to maintain standards, to keep out the wrong kind of people, and it had all been based on the most shallow, ignorant prejudices imaginable. "Mr. Harrison," I tried again, my voice shaking now. "I sincerely apologize. I made a terrible mistake, and Yes, you did make a mistake," he interrupted gently. "And because of that mistake, I'm afraid your position here is no longer tenable." The words hit me like a physical blow. Fired. I was being fired in front of everyone, in the most public, humiliating way possible. 5 years of my life, everything I'd worked for, everything I'd built, gone in an instant because of 30 seconds of stupidity. I looked around the table at my colleagues, people I'd worked with for years, and saw nothing but pity and secondhand embarrassment. These were people who'd respected me, looked up to me, and now they were watching me get destroyed by my own prejudice and arrogance. "Please," I whispered, not caring anymore that I was begging in front of everyone. "Please, I can do better. I can change. That's not who I really am." Alexander studied me for a long moment, and I saw something shift in his expression. For just a second, I thought maybe there was hope. Maybe he could see past what I'd done to who I could become. But then he shook his head. "I'm sure you believe that, Miss Thompson. But actions have consequences. And the way you treated me, the way you would have treated anyone who didn't meet your arbitrary standards, that's unacceptable in any business that serves the public." I felt tears burning behind my eyes. But I refused to let them fall. Not here. Not in front of everyone. I had that much dignity left. At least. Patricia cleared her throat uncomfortably. "Madison, perhaps you should gather your things." The walk back to my office felt like a death march. Every step echoed in the marble hallway, and I could feel eyes on me from every direction. Word travels fast in a hotel, and by the time I reached my door, everyone knew. The woman who'd been so confident, so successful, so sure of herself, had just been publicly humiliated and fired by a backpacker she'd dismissed. I packed my personal items with trembling hands. Photos, my favorite coffee mug, the little plant I'd kept on my windowsill. 5 years of my professional life fit into a single cardboard box, and that somehow made everything worse as I walked out of the Grandview for the last time. Carrying my box of shame, I caught a glimpse of Alexander through the conference room windows. He was back to business, discussing quarterly reports like he hadn't just destroyed someone's career. And maybe that was the worst part of all, that what had been earth-shattering for me was just another day at the office for him. I drove home in a daze, my perfect life crumbling around me like a house of cards in a hurricane. Little did I know that the real storm was just beginning. That night, Hurricane Elena decided to pay Miami a visit. I was sitting in my apartment, still in shock from the morning's disaster, when the emergency alert started blaring on my phone. The weatherman's voice cut through my numbness. Category 3 hurricane making landfall. Immediate evacuation recommended for coastal areas. Winds up to 120 miles expected. Normally, I would have been prepared. I would have had my evacuation plan ready, my important documents packed, my car gassed up and pointed toward higher ground. But nothing about this day had been normal, and I was still reeling from having my entire life ripped apart in a conference room. I just sat there on my couch, staring at the wall, listening to the wind pick up outside my windows. Part of me didn't even care anymore. What was the point of running from a storm when everything I'd worked for was already destroyed? But around 9 p.m., guilt started eating at me. Not guilt about the hurricane. Guilt about what I'd done to Alexander. The more I replayed that conversation in the hotel lobby, the more disgusted I became with myself. I'd been so cruel, so unnecessarily judgmental. The man had simply asked for a room, and I'd treated him like garbage based on nothing but his clothes and backpack. Maybe it was the storm messing with my head, or maybe it was some twisted need for punishment. But I found myself getting dressed and heading out into the chaos. I told myself I was going to check on the hotel, make sure everything was secure, but deep down I knew that was a lie. I was hoping to run into Alexander, to somehow find a way to apologize properly. The streets were already flooding by the time I made it to South Beach. Palm trees were bending at impossible angles, and debris was flying everywhere. Smart people were safely inland by now, but there I was, driving through a hurricane because I couldn't live with what I'd done. I parked as close to the beach as I could and started walking toward the water. The wind was so strong I could barely stay upright, and the rain felt like needles against my skin. It was absolute madness, but I kept going. That's when I saw him. Alexander was about 50 yards down the beach, and at first I thought I was hallucinating. But no, there he was, fighting against the wind and waves, trying to help what looked like a family trapped in the wreckage of a beach pavilion that had collapsed. A man, woman, and 2 small kids were huddled together, and Alexander was trying to pull debris away from them. For a split second, I froze. This was the man who'd fired me just hours earlier, who'd humiliated me in front of my entire staff. Every logical part of my brain was screaming at me to turn around and get to safety. But watching him risk his life for complete strangers, I saw something I'd completely missed before. Genuine character. Without thinking, I ran toward them. "What are you doing here?" Alexander shouted over the wind when he saw me approaching. A piece of flying metal had gashed his forehead, and blood was mixing with rainwater on his face. "Same thing you are." "Apparently," I yelled back, grabbing one end of a heavy beam that had pinned the family. On 3, we lifted together, and the father was able to pull his children free. The whole family was scraped up but mobile, and Alexander started guiding them toward a concrete building that looked like it might survive the storm. "There's a shelter about half a mile inland," he called to them. "Stay low and keep moving." But as we watched them disappear into the storm, a massive wave crashed over the seawall and knocked both Alexander and me to the ground. When I struggled to my feet, I realized he wasn't getting up. He was conscious but clearly hurt. That gash on his head was worse than I'd thought, and he was favoring his left leg. "Can you walk?" I asked, helping him sit up. "I think so, but not far," he admitted, and I could hear the pain in his voice. The nearest shelter was too far away for him to make it in his condition, but I remembered seeing a small maintenance building earlier, something that looked solid enough to wait out the worst of the storm. It was our only option. Getting there was like something out of a nightmare. We had to fight against wind that wanted to throw us into the ocean, dodge flying debris, and navigate flooding that was getting deeper by the minute. Alexander leaned heavily on me, and more than once I thought we weren't going to make it. But somehow, we did. The maintenance building was cramped and smelled like motor oil, but it was dry and sturdy. I found some old tarps and made a makeshift bed while Alexander slumped against the wall, looking pale and exhausted. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly once we'd caught our breath. "Help those people. Help me." I was cleaning his head wound with water from a bottle I'd found, trying not to think about how close we were sitting, how his eyes looked in the dim emergency lighting. Yes, I did. Why? The question hung between us in the small space. Why had I risked my life for a man who'd fired me? Why had I cared more about strangers than my own safety? I wasn't sure I had a good answer. "Because," I said finally, "watching you out there, that's who you really are, isn't it? You weren't testing anyone or proving a point. You were just helping because people needed help." He was quiet for a long moment. "And you think that changes what happened at the hotel?" "No," I admitted. "What I did was inexcusable. I judged you based on your appearance, and I was wrong. I was horrible. But seeing you tonight, it made me realize how much I miss about people in general." The storm raged outside our little shelter for 5 days. 5 days of being trapped together, talking about everything and nothing, sharing the few supplies we had, learning who each other really was when all the pretenses were stripped away. I told him about growing up middle class, about my father's pride when I got the hotel job, about how I'd convinced myself that maintaining standards was the same thing as having integrity. He told me about losing his parents when he was 15, about the weight of inheriting a business empire before he was old enough to understand what it meant. The backpacker thing, he explained on day 3, when we were sharing a can of soup we'd found in a storage cabinet. It's the only way I can see people as they really are. When someone thinks you're nobody, you learn everything you need to know about their character. And what did you learn about mine? I asked, even though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. That you're honest, he said, surprising me. You were cruel, but you were honestly cruel. You didn't pretend to be something you weren't. I can work with honest. By the time the rescue teams found us, something had shifted between us. I can't pinpoint exactly when it happened, but somewhere between the fear and the vulnerability and the long conversations in the dark, we'd stopped being the hotel manager in the air and started being just Madison and Alexander, 2 people who'd found each other in the middle of a storm. On the second night in our makeshift shelter, when the hurricane's fury had settled into a steady, relentless howl, Alexander finally opened up about his past. We were sitting against opposite walls of the small maintenance room, sharing a flashlight between us. The emergency lighting had died hours earlier, and the darkness made everything feel more intimate, more honest somehow. I was rewrapping the bandage around his head wound. I'd torn strips from my blouse to make it, when he started talking. I was 15 when they died, he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the storm. My parents, Edward and Catherine Harrison, everyone called it an accident, but I always wondered. I stopped what I was doing and looked at him in the dim light. There was something in his tone, a pain that went deeper than just losing family. What kind of accident? Car crash, late at night, on a road they had no business being on. He was staring at his hands, and I could see the weight of old grief in his shoulders. The police said Dad fell asleep at the wheel, but he was the most careful driver I knew. Never even got a speeding ticket. I wanted to reach out and touch his hand, but something held me back. We were still finding our way with each other, still figuring out what this strange connection between us meant. The weeks before they died were tense, he continued. There were a lot of closed-door meetings, hushed phone calls that stopped when I walked into the room. Mom had been crying more than usual, and Dad looked like he'd aged 10 years in a month. Did you ever find out what was going on? He shook his head. After the funeral, everyone just told me I needed to focus on my future, on taking over the company when I was ready. Victoria, my cousin, moved in to help take care of me. She was 18, just finished high school, and suddenly she was responsible for a grieving 15-year-old and learning the hotel business. The way he said Victoria's name made something twist in my stomach, though I couldn't put my finger on why. There was history there, complicated history. I threw myself into learning everything I could about the business, Alexander went on. It was easier than dealing with the grief, you know. Numbers made sense. Profit margins were predictable, people. He looked up at me with a sad smile. People were the complicated part. Is that why you do the backpacker thing? I asked. To figure people out. Partly. He shifted against the wall, wincing slightly as his injured leg protested. But mostly because I learned early that money changes everything. The way people look at you, talk to you, treat you. I wanted to know who I really was when all of that was stripped away. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, remembering how I'd treated him. And I failed that test spectacularly. Actually, he said, and there was something almost gentle in his voice. You didn't. What do you mean I was horrible to you? You were honest, he said, echoing what he'd told me before. Look, Madison, I've had people fawn over me, agree with everything I say, laugh at jokes that aren't funny, all because they want something from me. That's not honesty. That's performance. I was cleaning the cut on his forehead again, and being this close to him, seeing the sincerity in his eyes, made my heart do strange things. So you prefer people who are mean to you? He laughed, and the sound was warm in our cold little shelter. I prefer people who react authentically, even if that reaction isn't pleasant. When you turned me away from the hotel, you weren't putting on an act. You genuinely believed you were protecting something you cared about. I was protecting my own prejudices, I said bitterly. Maybe, but you were also protecting something you'd worked hard for. Your standards were wrong, but your passion for your job was real. That's more than I can say for most people I meet. I sat back on my heels, studying his face in the flickering light. I don't understand you at all. What don't you understand? How you can be so forgiving? I hurt you. I humiliated you in front of God knows how many people who might have witnessed that scene. And here you are, talking to me like we're friends." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer, more vulnerable. "Do you want to know what I really learned from my parents' death?" I nodded. "That life is too short to hold on to anger, whatever was troubling them in those last weeks, whatever drove them out onto that dark road. It was probably something that could have been resolved with a conversation. But pride or fear or stubbornness got in the way, and then it was too late." He looked directly at me, and I felt something shift between us, something deeper than forgiveness or understanding. "I don't want to live like that, Madison. I don't want to let pride or hurt feelings keep me from seeing who people really are." "And who do you think I really am?" The question slipped out before I could stop it, and I immediately regretted asking. It sounded needy, desperate, but Alexander didn't seem to mind. He considered the question seriously, tilting his head as he studied me. "I think you're someone who cares deeply about doing the right thing, but you've never really examined what right means to you. I think you're stronger than you know and more vulnerable than you show, and I think you're probably the first person in years who's talked to me like I'm just a regular guy." My throat felt tight, even after I was so awful to you. "Especially after that." He smiled, and this time it reached his eyes. "Look, anyone can be nice to someone they think is important. It takes real character to be genuinely kind to someone you think is beneath you. You weren't kind to me that day, but you're being kind to me now. That tells me everything I need to know about who you choose to be when it matters." I had to look away, because the intensity in his eyes was making it hard to breathe. "I don't deserve your forgiveness." "Maybe not," he said quietly, "but I'm giving it to you anyway. The question is, what are you going to do with it?" Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside our little shelter, something peaceful had settled between us. For the first time in days, maybe years, I felt like someone was seeing me clearly, not the polished professional version I presented to the world, but the messy, flawed, real me underneath. And somehow, incredibly, he didn't seem to mind what he saw. That night, as we settled in to try to get some sleep, Alexander said something that would stay with me forever. "You know what the difference is between someone who deserves a second chance and someone who doesn't." "What?" "Someone who deserves it is usually the last person to ask for one." As I lay there listening to his breathing even out in sleep, I realized that somewhere between the storm and the shelter and the conversations in the dark, something had fundamentally changed in how I saw the world. More importantly, something had changed in how I saw myself when the rescue helicopter finally found us on the 5th day. I honestly thought my story with Alexander was over. The paramedics checked us both out. Alexander needed stitches for his head wound and had a mild concussion, while I'd somehow escaped with nothing worse than cuts and bruises as they loaded us into the helicopter. I kept stealing glances at him, wondering if everything that had happened between us in that shelter had been real or just some weird product of extreme circumstances. I mean, think about it. 5 days trapped together, sharing our deepest thoughts and fears. That's not exactly normal relationship territory. Maybe once we got back to the real world, back to our actual lives, he'd remember that I was the woman who'd humiliated him and treated him like garbage. Maybe the forgiveness he'd offered in the darkness wouldn't survive in the daylight. They took us to different hospitals for evaluation, and I spent the next 2 days replaying every conversation we'd had, wondering what came next. I had no job, no prospects, and no idea how to even begin rebuilding my life. Worse than that, I couldn't stop thinking about Alexander, the way he'd talked about his parents, the gentleness in his voice when he'd forgiven me, the way he'd risked his life for complete strangers. I was discharged on a Wednesday morning with instructions to rest and follow up with my doctor in a week. I took a cab home to my apartment, which thankfully hadn't suffered any major damage from the hurricane, and tried to figure out what the hell I was supposed to do with the rest of my life. That's when my phone rang. "Madison." Alexander's voice was warm, familiar, and hearing it made something flutter in my chest. "Are you feeling better?" "I'm fine," I said, though my heart was beating way too fast. "How's your head?" 12 stitches and a headache that won't quit, but I'll live." I could hear the smile in his voice. "Listen, I was wondering if you'd be free to meet me for coffee this afternoon. There's something I'd like to discuss with you." My stomach dropped. This was it. The polite but firm conversation where he'd thank me for helping during the storm, and then explain why we couldn't have any kind of relationship going forward, professional or otherwise. Of course, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Where would you like to meet? There's a little place called Cafe Luna about 10 minutes from your apartment, 2 o'clock. The fact that he knew where I lived should have surprised me, but I figured he probably had access to my employment records. I'll be there. I spent the next 3 hours trying on different outfits, doing my hair, applying makeup, then taking it all off and starting over. I had no idea what I was dressing for. A job interview, a goodbye, a friendship. By the time I left for the cafe, I was a nervous wreck. Cafe Luna turned out to be this tiny, hole-in-the-wall place with mismatched furniture and the smell of fresh pastries hanging in the air. It was the kind of place I would have turned my nose up at a week ago, but now it felt warm and welcoming. Alexander was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with 2 cups of coffee in front of him. He looked different in civilian clothes, jeans and a simple button-down shirt, with a small bandage still covering his stitches. More like the backpacker I'd first met than the powerful businessman who'd fired me. You came, he said, standing up as I approached the table. You sounded like it was important. He gestured for me to sit, and I noticed his hands were slightly shaky. Was he nervous too? That seemed impossible. Madison, he began, then stopped and ran a hand through his hair. I've been thinking a lot about our conversation in the shelter, about second chances and what people do with them. Here it comes, I thought, the gentle letdown. I want to offer you a job. I blinked. Excuse me, not your old job, he said quickly. Something different, something that would make better use of your skills and your passion for protecting things you care about. I stared at him, sure I was hallucinating. Alexander, I don't understand. You fired me, very publicly, very definitively. I fired Madison Thompson. Hotel manager, he said. I'm talking to Madison Thompson, the woman who risked her life to help strangers in a hurricane, the woman who spent 5 days taking care of someone she had every reason to hate. My coffee cup was shaking in my hands. What kind of job? Partnership, actually. He leaned forward, and his eyes were bright with excitement. The hurricane damaged 6 of our Miami properties. Instead of just rebuilding them the way they were, I want to reimagine them completely. Create something that serves the community, not just wealthy tourists. I don't know anything about community development, but you know about hospitality. You know about creating experiences that matter to people. And you've seen firsthand how quickly life can change. How important it is to help each other when things go wrong. I was struggling to process what he was saying. You want me to be your partner? After what I did? Because of what you did? He corrected. And because of what you did after that? Look, Madison, I need someone who won't just tell me what I want to hear. Someone who'll push back when I'm making mistakes. Someone who cares enough about our standards to protect them, even if those standards need to evolve. The irony wasn't lost on me. A week ago, I'd been so proud of my ability to maintain the Grandview's exclusive atmosphere. Now he was asking me to help create something inclusive, something that would welcome people regardless of their appearance or background. What if I screw it up? I asked. What if I fall back into old patterns? Then we'll deal with it, he said simply. But I don't think you will. People don't usually go through what we went through and come out the same. He was right about that. The woman sitting in this cafe was different from the one who'd turned him away from the hotel. I felt it in my bones. A fundamental shift in how I saw the world and my place in it. There's one condition, Alexander continued. We do this as equal partners, 50-50 ownership, shared decision-making, your name on the letterhead. I'm not offering you charity or trying to assuage my guilt. I'm offering you this because I think we could build something amazing together. Equal partners. After spending my entire career clawing my way up from the bottom, fighting for every promotion, every ounce of respect, he was handing me something I'd never dared to dream of. Why? I whispered. Why would you trust me with something this important? Alexander reached across the table and took my hand, and the touch sent electricity shooting up my arm. Because in that shelter, when everything else was stripped away, I saw who you really are. And who you really are is someone worth trusting. I looked down at our joined hands, at this man who'd turned my world upside down, and then offered to help me rebuild it into something better. 6 months ago, if someone had told me I'd be sitting in a quirky cafe, holding hands with a billionaire heir who wanted to make me his business partner, I'd have laughed in their face. But life has a way of surprising you, doesn't it? Okay, I said, meeting his eyes. Let's build something amazing. His smile was brighter than the Miami sunshine streaming through the cafe windows. Partners, he asked. Partners, I agreed. Neither of us knew it then, but we were about to become so much more. Victoria Mills walked into my life like a perfectly manicured storm cloud on what should have been one of the happiest days of my new career. It was 3 weeks after Alexander and I had shaken hands in that little cafe, and we were standing in the ruins of what used to be the Harrison Ocean View Resort. The hurricane had gutted the lobby, shattered every window facing the water, and left the whole place looking like a concrete skeleton. But when Alexander talked about his vision for rebuilding it as a community center with affordable accommodations, I could see it. I could see families gathering in the common areas, local artists displaying their work in the galleries, kids taking swimming lessons in the renovated pool. The first floor will be completely open to the public, Alexander was explaining to our architect, his voice animated with excitement. Community meetings, art classes, maybe even a small health clinic. The upper floors can still function as hotel rooms, but we'll reserve 30% for local residents who need temporary housing. I was scribbling notes on my tablet, already thinking about partnerships with local nonprofits, when I heard the sharp click of designer heels on broken concrete. Alexander, darling, what on earth are you doing to our beautiful hotel? The voice was cultured, with just a hint of a British accent that screamed expensive boarding school. I looked up to see a woman who belonged on the cover of a business magazine. Tall, blonde, impeccably dressed, despite standing in a construction zone. Everything about her was perfect, from her flawless makeup to her tailored suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Victoria. Alexander's face lit up with genuine warmth. I wasn't expecting you back from London until next month. She glided toward us with the kind of confidence that comes from never doubting your place in the world. When she reached Alexander, she kissed both his cheeks in that European way that made me feel suddenly provincial. I couldn't stay away when I heard about your little renovation project, she said, her pale blue eyes scanning the destruction around us. Though I must say, the reports didn't quite capture the full extent of the damage. Victoria Mills, meet Madison Thompson, my new business partner, Alexander said, and I caught the slight emphasis he put on the word partner. Madison. Victoria is our chief financial officer and my cousin. She's been with the company since we were teenagers. Victoria's smile was polite but cool as she extended a perfectly manicured hand. Ms. Thompson, how interesting to meet Alexander's new associate. Associate, not partner. The correction was subtle but unmistakable. It's a pleasure, I said, shaking her hand and trying not to wince at her grip, which was surprisingly strong. Alexander's told me so much about you. Has he? Victoria's eyebrows rose slightly. How curious. He's told me absolutely nothing about you. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and I felt heat creep up my neck. Alexander jumped in quickly. Madison and I met during the hurricane. She's going to help me reimagine how we approach hospitality in the post-storm communities. How philanthropic, Victoria said, and somehow she made charity work sound like a character flaw. And what's your background? Ms. Thompson. Hotel management, community development, urban planning. Actually, I was the general manager at the Grandview, I said, lifting my chin slightly. I wasn't going to let this woman intimidate me, no matter how perfectly put together she was. Something flickered across Victoria's face. Surprise, maybe, or recognition. The Grandview, how coincidental. Isn't that one of our properties? It is, Alexander said carefully. Madison and I have some history there. How fascinating. Victoria's smile sharpened. I'm sure there's quite a story behind that. I could feel the undercurrents of something I didn't understand. Some dynamic between Alexander and Victoria that went deeper than business relationships, or even family ties. The way she looked at him wasn't purely professional or purely familial. There was possession there, ownership, like she was marking territory. Well, Victoria continued, turning back to Alexander, I suppose I should hear all about these exciting new plans. Perhaps we could discuss them over dinner tonight, just the two of us. Like old times, "Actually," Alexander said, and I felt a flutter of something that might have been relief. "Madison and I have plans tonight. We're meeting with some community leaders about the project." Victoria's smile didn't waver, but something cold flashed in her eyes. "Of course. How dedicated of you both." She spent the next hour touring the property with us, asking pointed questions about budgets and timelines and return on investment. Every question was perfectly reasonable, perfectly professional, but they felt like tiny daggers aimed at the heart of what Alexander and I were trying to build. "I'm just concerned about the financial viability," she said, as we stood in what used to be the hotel's elegant restaurant. "Community centers are lovely in theory, but they don't generate the kind of revenue our shareholders expect." "Some things are more important than maximum profit," Alexander replied. And I heard an edge in his voice that hadn't been there before. "How wonderfully idealistic," Victoria said. "Your parents would be surprised by this change in direction." The mention of his parents hit Alexander like a physical blow. I saw his jaw tighten, his hands clenched slightly at his sides. Victoria noticed too, and something satisfied flickered across her face. "The Harrison legacy has always been about excellence and exclusivity," she continued. "I'd hate to see that diluted in the name of social justice." "The Harrison legacy," Alexander said quietly, "is whatever I choose to make it." After Victoria left, back to her 5-star hotel downtown, she mentioned pointedly, Alexander was different, quieter, more tense. As we drove to our community meeting that evening, I finally worked up the courage to ask, "Is everything okay? You seem upset." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, his hands tight on the steering wheel. "Victoria and our relationship is complicated." "Complicated how?" "She's not just my cousin. After my parents died, she moved in to help take care of me. We were both so young, so lost. For a while, we were all each other had." Something twisted in my stomach. "Were you together?" "No," he said quickly. "Not exactly, but I think Victoria always assumed that eventually we would be, that it was just a matter of time before I realized we belonged together. And you don't feel that way." He glanced over at me, and something warm flickered in his eyes. "No, Madison, I don't." The relief I felt was stronger than it should have been. We were business partners. Nothing more, at least. That's what I kept telling myself. "She doesn't like me," I said. "Victoria doesn't like change," Alexander replied. "And you represent a pretty significant change." As we pulled into the community center where our meeting was being held, I caught sight of my reflection in the passenger window, next to Victoria's polished perfection. I probably looked like exactly what I was, a middle-class hotel manager trying to play in a league that was way out of her depth. But then I thought about the families we'd met that day, the people who'd lost everything in the hurricane and were trying to rebuild their lives. I thought about the vision Alexander and I shared for creating something that would actually help people, instead of just catering to the wealthy. Victoria Mills might have history with Alexander, might have money and connections, and the kind of effortless elegance I'd never possess, but she didn't have what I had. Alexander's trust, his partnership, his belief that we could build something meaningful together. At least I hoped she didn't. As we walked into the meeting, I couldn't shake the feeling that Victoria's unexpected return was about more than just checking on hurricane damage. Something about the way she'd looked at Alexander, the possessiveness in her voice when she talked about the Harrison legacy, told me that my real challenges were just beginning. I had no idea how right I was. 6 months after that first meeting with Victoria, Alexander and I had fallen into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. We spent our days knee-deep in construction dust and community meetings, transforming damaged hotels into something Miami had never seen before. Our first project, the old Ocean View Resort, was becoming a hybrid community center and boutique hotel that somehow managed to be both profitable and purposeful. Local artists were painting murals in the lobby. Families were moving into affordable extended stay suites, and every morning I woke up excited about the work we were doing. But somewhere along the way, the work had stopped being the most important part of my day. The most important part had become the moments when Alexander would catch my eye across a conference table and smile. Or when we'd grab late-night takeout and plan our next project. Or when he'd absently brush plaster dust out of my hair after a site visit. I was falling in love with him. And I was pretty sure he was falling in love with me too. It happened gradually. Then all at once, the way the best love stories always do, there wasn't a single moment when everything changed. Just 1,000 tiny moments that added up to something I'd never experienced before. The way he listened when I talked, like every word mattered. The way he trusted me with decisions that affected millions of dollars and hundreds of lives. The way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. The night everything shifted between us was in late October, when we were working late in the temporary office we'd set up in one of the renovated hotel suites. We'd been fighting with the city planning department all day about zoning variances, and both of us were exhausted and frustrated. "I don't understand why they're making this so difficult," I said, throwing my pen down on the stack of paperwork we'd been wrestling with for hours. "We're literally trying to help people. We're creating jobs, providing housing, offering services the community needs. What's not to love?" Alexander leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. "Because change is scary, even when it's good change. People are comfortable with the way things have always been. Well, the way things have always been sucked for a lot of people," I said bluntly. He laughed, and the sound was tired but genuine. "This is why I need you, Madison. You cut through all the political B's and focus on what actually matters." Something in his voice made me look up. He was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Intense, almost vulnerable. "What?" I asked, suddenly self-conscious. "I was just thinking about how different my life is now," he said quietly. 6 months ago, I was going through the motions, doing what I thought I was supposed to do now. Now what? Now I wake up every morning excited about what we're building. Not just the hotels, but this. Us. Whatever this is. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. "Alexander, I know we're business partners," he said quickly. "I know this complicates things, but I can't pretend anymore that what I feel for you is purely professional." I stared at him across the cluttered desk. This man who'd turned my world upside down and then helped me rebuild it into something beautiful. 6 months ago, I'd been a different person. Narrow-minded, focused on all the wrong things, building walls instead of bridges. He'd seen past all of that to something worth saving, something worth believing in. "It's not purely professional for me either," I admitted. He stood up slowly, like he was afraid any sudden movement might break the moment. I stood too, and suddenly we were facing each other across 3 feet of space that felt both infinite and non-existent. "Madison," he said, and my name in his voice sounded like a prayer. When he kissed me, it was nothing like the passionate, dramatic kisses you see in movies. It was gentle, tentative, like he was asking a question and waiting for my answer. I kissed him back, and the answer was yes. Yes to everything we could be together. The next few months were the happiest of my life. We kept our relationship quiet at first, partly because mixing business with pleasure is always tricky, but mostly because what we had felt too precious to share with the world right away. We were creating something magical together, both professionally and personally, and I wanted to protect it. We spent weekends exploring Miami neighborhoods we'd never paid attention to before, looking for inspiration for our next projects. Alexander showed me the city through different eyes, not just the glamorous South Beach tourist spots, but the vibrant communities where real people lived and worked and raised their families. I showed him how to see past surface impressions, how to find beauty and potential in unexpected places. Our first project was such a success that we started getting calls from other cities hit by natural disasters. Houston wanted us to look at post-Harvey recovery. Puerto Rico was interested in our community-focused model. Suddenly, we weren't just rebuilding a few hotels. We were pioneering a whole new approach to disaster recovery and community development. "We're going to change how the world thinks about hospitality," Alexander said one evening, as we walked along the beach near our rebuilt Ocean View property. Families were having picnics on the sand. Kids were playing in the waves. And through the floor-to-ceiling windows of our community center, we could see a senior citizens art class in session. "We already have," I said, taking his hand. "Look at this place 6 months ago. It was just expensive real estate sitting empty after the storm. Now it's alive. It's helping people." He stopped walking and turned to face me, the setting sun painting everything golden around us. "I love you, Madison." The words hung in the air between us, perfect and terrifying and absolutely right. "I love you too," I said, and I'd never meant anything more in my entire life. When he proposed 3 months later, on the beach where we'd first really found each other during the hurricane, I didn't hesitate for even a second. This was the man who'd seen the worst of me and helped me become the best version of myself. This was the partner who shared my dreams and made them bigger, brighter, more meaningful than I'd ever imagined they could be. Planning our wedding became another project we threw ourselves into with the same passion we brought to everything else. We wanted something that reflected who we'd become together. Elegant but not pretentious, meaningful but not overly serious. We booked the ballroom at our renovated Ocean View property, planning to have the ceremony on the beach and the reception inside. Surrounded by the community we'd helped build, I should have known that happiness this complete couldn't last without being tested. I should have been paying more attention to the way Victoria watched us at company meetings, the subtle comments she made about our unconventional approach to business, the way she always seemed to be asking questions about my background, my family, my history. I should have realized that someone who'd spent 20 years assuming she'd eventually marry Alexander wouldn't give up without a fight. But I was too busy being happy, too caught up in building a life with the man I loved, too confident that love would be enough to overcome whatever obstacles came our way. I had no idea that the biggest obstacle was already gathering ammunition to destroy everything we'd built together. The day before my wedding, I was standing in the bridal suite at our Ocean View property, staring at myself in the full-length mirror while the seamstress made final adjustments to my dress. It was perfect, simple, elegant, with delicate lace sleeves that reminded me of ocean foam. When I'd tried it on for the first time 3 months earlier, Alexander had insisted on paying for it, but I'd refused. This was one thing I wanted to do for myself. With money I'd earned through our partnership, it felt important somehow, like proof that I was walking into this marriage as an equal. "You look absolutely radiant, darling," said Elena, the wedding coordinator we'd hired. She was bustling around the room, checking and double-checking every detail. "Mr. Harrison is going to lose his mind when he sees you tomorrow." I smiled at my reflection, thinking about Alexander's face when I'd walked down the aisle. We'd written our own vows, and I'd spent weeks trying to find words that captured what he meant to me. How he'd seen past my worst moments to the person I could become. How he'd given me not just love, but purpose. How together we were building something that mattered. "Miss Thompson?" The seamstress's voice interrupted my thoughts. "I think we're all set. The dress fits like a dream." As she packed up her supplies, Elena checked her watch. "The hair and makeup team will be here at 8 tomorrow morning, and the photographer wants to start with getting ready shots at 9. The ceremony is at 4, which gives us plenty of time for—" She was cut off by a sharp knock at the door. "Come in," I called, expecting to see one of the hotel staff with some last-minute question about the reception setup. Instead, Victoria Mills walked in. She was impeccably dressed as always, in a navy blue dress that probably cost more than most people's cars. But there was something different about her today, something sharp and predatory in her smile that made my stomach clench with unease. "Victoria?" I said, trying to keep my voice pleasant. "What a surprise. I thought you were in New York until tomorrow." "I caught an earlier flight," she said, her pale blue eyes scanning the room before settling on me. "I simply couldn't miss your big day. After all, there are so many things to celebrate." The seamstress and Elena quickly excused themselves, sensing the tension that had suddenly filled the room. Victoria waited until the door closed behind them before speaking again. "You look lovely," she said, though her tone suggested the opposite. "White is such an interesting choice for a second wedding." "It's my first wedding," I said, confused. "Oh, I don't mean marriage." Victoria's smile sharpened. "I mean the second time you've tried to build a life on someone else's foundation." My heart started beating faster. "I don't know what you're talking about." Victoria walked over to the dresser and set down a manila folder I hadn't noticed her carrying. "Don't you? Let me refresh your memory, Robert Thompson. Does that name ring any bells?" The blood drained from my face. "My father. How did she know about my father?" "I can see it does," Victoria continued, her voice silky with satisfaction. "Fascinating man. Your father. Very talented businessman. Very creative with other people's money." My hands were shaking now. "What do you want, Victoria?" "I want you to know exactly who you are and what you've done," she said, opening the folder and pulling out a stack of documents. 20 years ago, Your father was a partner in Harrison Holdings. Did you know that? Madison, did you know that your comfortable middle-class upbringing was funded by money stolen from Alexander's family? I stared at the papers she was holding. Financial records, legal documents, things that looked official and damning and impossible. That's not true, I whispered. Oh, but it is. Victoria's voice was triumphant now. Your father embezzled millions from the company. He falsified records, created phantom accounts, systematically drained the business that Edward and Catherine Harrison had spent their lives building. The room was spinning. I gripped the back of a chair to keep from falling. The worst part, Victoria continued relentlessly, is how he did it. He blackmailed Edward with fabricated evidence of tax evasion, threatened to destroy the family's reputation unless Edward gave him access to company funds. Your father was very convincing, very thorough. He made Edward believe that paying him was the only way to protect the Harrison name. Stop, I said, but my voice came out as barely a whisper. Edward and Catherine Harrison didn't die in an accident. Madison, they killed themselves. They chose death over the shame and financial ruin your father had orchestrated. They left a suicide note explaining everything. But of course, that information was sealed to protect the family's privacy. I was going to be sick. This couldn't be true. My father had been a good man, a loving father who'd worked hard to provide for his family. He'd never stolen anything, never hurt anyone. Alexander was 15 years old when he found his parents' bodies, Victoria said, and her voice had gone cold now. 15 years old, and suddenly responsible for a company that was hemorrhaging money because of your father's theft. Why are you telling me this? I managed to ask. Because, Victoria said, moving closer, your father knew he was dying, cancer, wasn't it? And before he died, he did something interesting. He got you that job at the Grandview. My legs gave out, and I sank into the chair I'd been gripping. That wasn't a coincidence, darling. Your father arranged for you to work at one of Alexander's properties because he wanted you to. What? Make amends? Pay some kind of penance? The coward couldn't face what he'd done himself, so he set up his daughter to clean up his mess. Victoria pulled out another document, a letter in my father's handwriting. He wrote this before he died, she said. A confession, an apology, instructions for you to discover the truth and beg Alexander's forgiveness on his behalf. Very touching, really. Except I intercepted it before it could be delivered to you. I was crying now, silent tears streaming down my face as the weight of what she was saying crashed over me. My entire life, my job, my relationship with Alexander, everything I thought I'd built, it was all contaminated by my father's crimes. The beautiful irony, Victoria continued, is that Alexander hired you to work on his hurricane recovery projects, specifically because you were Robert Thompson's daughter. Did you really think it was coincidence that he was so forgiving after you humiliated him? He knew exactly who you were from the moment you rejected him at the hotel. My world was crumbling around me. Alexander had known. He'd always known. Our entire relationship was built on his desire for, what, revenge? Some twisted form of justice. I've spent months watching you play house with him, Victoria said, her mask of civility finally slipping away completely. Watching you believe that you'd found true love, that you deserved happiness after everything your family took from his. It's been quite entertaining. She leaned down so her face was close to mine. Your father destroyed Alexander's family. He's the reason those beautiful, gentle people are dead, and now you want to have the fairy tale ending that his parents never got to see. Victoria straightened up and smoothed her dress. I don't think so. She headed toward the door, then paused and looked back at me one last time. The wedding is tomorrow at 4, isn't it? I wonder what Alexander will say when I tell him that his blushing bride has known the truth about her father all along. When I explain that you've been manipulating him, using his guilt and grief to secure your place in his life. I didn't know, I said desperately. I swear to God, I didn't know any of this. Victoria's smile was arctic. Well, you know now. The question is, what are you going to do about it? She left me there, surrounded by the ruins of everything I thought I knew about my life, holding the pieces of a truth that would destroy the only real happiness I'd ever known. I don't remember getting out of that bridal suite or driving to the beach where Alexander and I had first truly found each other. I just remember suddenly being there, standing on the sand in my jeans and t-shirt, watching the man I loved rehearse his wedding vows in the dying light of the day. He was alone, which wasn't unusual. Alexander often came here when he needed to think. And tomorrow was our wedding day. He probably wanted to practice his words one more time, make sure he got them right. The sight of him standing there, so focused and earnest, made my heart break all over again. How could I marry him tomorrow, knowing what I knew now? How could I stand at that altar and promise to love him forever when our entire relationship was built on lies and blood money? But how could I not tell him the truth? How could I let Victoria be the one to reveal my father's crimes, to twist everything we'd built together into something ugly and manipulative? "Alexander," I called out, my voice carried by the ocean breeze. He turned, and his face lit up with that smile that had become my favorite thing in the world. "Madison, what are you doing here? Aren't you supposed to be getting your beauty sleep before the big day?" He jogged over to me, and when he tried to pull me into his arms, I stepped back. The hurt that flashed across his face was like a knife to my chest. "We need to talk," I said, and something in my voice must have warned him because his expression immediately grew serious. "What's wrong?" "Victoria came to see me tonight." Alexander's jaw tightened. "What did she say?" "She told me about my father." The words came out as barely a whisper. "About Robert Thompson and what he did to your parents." For a moment, Alexander just stared at me. Then he closed his eyes and ran a hand through his hair. When he looked at me again, I saw something I'd never seen before in his eyes. Defeat. "How much did she tell you?" "Everything." I was crying now, tears streaming down my face in the twilight. The embezzlement, the blackmail, the suicide, all of it. Alexander was quiet for a long time, staring out at the waves. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible over the sound of the ocean. "I've been waiting for this conversation for months." "You've known all along," I said. It wasn't a question. "I've known who you were since the day you turned me away from the hotel," he admitted. "Madison Thompson, daughter of Robert Thompson. I've had investigators tracking your family for years, trying to understand what happened to my parents." The confirmation hit me like a physical blow, even though I'd been expecting it. "So everything between us, it was all a lie." "No." His voice was sharp, urgent. "Madison, no, that's not. God, this is such a mess." He turned to face me fully, and I could see the anguish in his expression. "Yes, I knew who you were when I offered you that partnership. And yes, at first it was about revenge. I wanted to see what kind of person the daughter of my parents' killer had become." "Killer?" The word came out strangled. "Your father killed them as surely as if he'd pulled a trigger," Alexander said. And for the first time since I'd known him, his voice was hard, cold. They trusted him. They considered him family, and he destroyed them for money. I wanted to defend my father, to insist that there had to be some mistake. But the evidence Victoria had shown me was overwhelming. Financial records, legal documents, my father's own handwritten confession. It was all true. "But Madison," Alexander continued, his voice softening, "what started as revenge became something completely different. When I saw who you really were, not your father's daughter, but your own person, everything changed." "How can you say that?" I was sobbing now, barely able to get the words out. "How can you separate me from what he did? I benefited from his crimes. I lived off stolen money. I got my job at the Grandview because he arranged it as some kind of twisted penance. Because you're not responsible for your father's choices," Alexander said firmly. "You were a child when he did those things. You had no idea." "But I should have known," I exploded. "I should have questioned how we could afford our house, our lifestyle, my college education. I should have wondered why my father always seemed so guilty, so haunted." I was willfully blind because it was easier than asking hard questions. "Madison, listen to me." "No, you listen to me." I wiped my eyes and straightened my shoulders. "Victoria was right. I don't deserve happiness. I don't deserve you. My family destroyed yours. And here I am trying to take the place of the mother you should have had walking you down the aisle tomorrow. Don't you dare let Victoria Mills poison what we have," Alexander said, and there was steel in his voice now. "Don't let her win. This isn't about winning or losing," I said. "This is about justice, about what's right. What's right, Alexander said, stepping closer to me, is that two people who love each other refuse to let the sins of the past destroy their future. How can you forgive me? I whispered. How can you even look at me knowing what my father did to your family? Because, he said, reaching out to cup my face in his hands, you're not your father, because you've spent the last year of your life trying to help people, trying to build something meaningful. Because when you had the chance to be cruel to a stranger who you thought was beneath you, you felt genuine remorse and changed. I wanted to believe him. God. I wanted to believe him so badly it physically hurt. Madison, he continued, I love you. Not despite who your father was, but because of who you chose to become. You could have stayed bitter and prejudiced and small. Instead, you opened your heart and let yourself grow. But Victoria has been planning this for months, Alexander said grimly. She's been waiting for the perfect moment to drop this bomb and destroy us. She hired those investigators. She intercepted your father's letter. She's been orchestrating all of this because she can't stand that I chose you instead of her. That's when we heard the slow clap behind us. We both turned to see Victoria emerging from the shadows of the dunes, her perfect hair and dress incongruous against the natural beauty of the beach. In her hand was something that made my blood run cold. A gun. Bravo, she said, her voice dripping with false admiration. What a touching scene. Star-crossed lovers, determined to overcome the sins of the past. It's quite romantic, really. Victoria, what the hell are you doing? Alexander demanded, moving protectively in front of me. I'm preventing a travesty, she said calmly. Your parents died because of her family, Alexander. They never got their happy ending. Why should she get hers? The gun was pointing directly at Alexander's chest, and I could see the madness in Victoria's eyes now, the obsession and rage that had been hidden beneath years of polished professionalism. If I can't have you, she said, then nobody can, especially not her. That's when Alexander said the words that would change everything. Victoria, you need to know something about the night my parents died, about who really told them that Robert was stealing from the company. Victoria's confident smile faltered slightly. What are you talking about? You were 17, Victoria. Jealous because Catherine was spending so much time with Robert's daughter, with Madison's older sister who died in that car accident. You made up the story about Robert embezzling money because you wanted Catherine's attention back. The gun trembled in Victoria's hands. That's not true. You told my parents that Robert was stealing from them, even though you had no proof. You planted that seed of suspicion because you were a jealous child who couldn't bear sharing Catherine's affection with another little girl. Victoria's face had gone white. Stop it. My parents investigated your claims and found evidence that seemed to support them. Evidence that Robert had planted himself, trying to cover up his actual financial difficulties. But the investigation never would have started without your lie. The truth hit me like a tidal wave. Victoria, jealous, obsessed Victoria, had been the catalyst for everything. Her childhood lie had set in motion the events that destroyed both our families. And now she was standing on the beach where Alexander and I had found each other, pointing a gun at the man I loved. Ready to complete the circle of destruction she'd started 20 years ago, the gun clattered to the sand as Victoria collapsed to her knees, the weight of 20 years of buried truth finally crushing her. I was just a child, she sobbed, her perfect composure completely shattered. I didn't know what would happen. I just wanted Catherine to love me the way she loved that little girl. I didn't mean for anyone to die. I stared at this woman who had terrorized me just hours earlier, now broken and vulnerable on the beach. All her rage, all her manipulation, all her desperate attempts to destroy what Alexander and I had built together. It all stemmed from a jealous child's lie that had spiraled far beyond anything she could have imagined. Alexander knelt down beside her, his voice gentle despite everything she'd just put us through. Victoria, you need help, professional help. This guilt has been eating you alive for 2 decades. I love them, she whispered. Edward and Catherine were like parents to me after my own parents died. I love them, and I destroyed them. You were 17 and traumatized, Alexander said. You made a mistake that had terrible consequences, but you were still a child. The adults in the situation should have handled things differently. I found myself kneeling on Victoria's other side, and I was as surprised as anyone by the compassion I felt for her. This woman had just threatened to kill the man I loved, had spent months systematically trying to destroy my happiness, and yet I could see the broken little girl underneath all that pain and anger. "Victoria," I said softly, "we can't change what happened 20 years ago, but we can choose how to move forward from here." She looked at me with red-rimmed eyes. "How can you not hate me? I've destroyed everything. Your father, Alexander's parents, your wedding. Because," I said, and I realized I meant it. Hatred just creates more pain, more destruction. Someone has to choose to break the cycle. The next few hours were a blur of police officers, paramedics, and crisis counselors. Victoria was taken to a psychiatric facility for evaluation and treatment. The investigation into what had happened 20 years ago was officially reopened, but this time with all the facts, all the truth, all the pain finally brought into the light. Alexander and I sat on the beach until sunrise, talking through everything that had been revealed, the trauma his parents had endured, the guilt my father had carried, the twisted web of lies and misunderstandings that had destroyed so many lives. "Do you still want to marry me?" I asked as the sky began to lighten. "After everything you know now?" Alexander took my hands in his, and his answer was everything I needed to hear. "Madison, I fell in love with who you are, not who your father was. What happened tonight doesn't change that. If anything, seeing how you responded to Victoria, how you chose compassion over hatred, it just makes me love you more." We decided to postpone the wedding by a week, not because we had doubts, but because we wanted time to process everything and to honor the memory of both our fathers properly. We spent those 7 days visiting their graves, talking to family members we'd never met, piecing together the full story of what had really happened. My father, I learned, had indeed made financial mistakes that put him in a difficult position, but the embezzlement charges were largely fabricated, desperate attempts to cover up legitimate business losses after Victoria's accusations had triggered an investigation. He'd been trying to protect the Harrison family's reputation, not destroy it. Alexander's parents had died not just from shame, but from the crushing realization that they'd trusted the wrong people and doubted a man who'd been like a brother to them. The suicide note they'd left was filled with regret and apologies to both families. "They were all victims," Alexander said as we stood at his parents' graveside. "Your father, my parents, even Victoria, victims of miscommunication, pride, and the inability to have honest conversations about difficult situations." When we finally had our wedding ceremony the following week, it was different from what we'd originally planned, smaller, more intimate, focused on healing rather than celebration. We wrote new vows that acknowledged our complicated history while promising to build a future based on truth, forgiveness, and the courage to have difficult conversations. "I promise," I said, looking into Alexander's eyes as we stood on the same beach where we'd almost lost everything, "to never let pride or fear keep me from telling you the truth, even when that truth is painful." "I promise," he replied, "to remember that love isn't about perfection, but about choosing each other again and again, especially when life gets complicated." 6 months later, we established the Harrison Thompson Foundation for Family Reconciliation, dedicated to helping families torn apart by misunderstandings, trauma, and the weight of unspoken truths. Victoria, after months of intensive therapy, became one of our first board members, channeling her guilt into a fierce determination to prevent other families from experiencing what ours had endured. Our hotel empire evolved, too, becoming a network of healing spaces where families could come together to work through their conflicts with the help of trained counselors and mediators. We learned that hospitality wasn't just about providing luxury accommodations. It was about creating safe spaces where people could be vulnerable, honest, and ultimately heal. A year after our wedding, Alexander and I were sitting in the lobby of our newest property, a family reconciliation center in San Juan, when he showed me a letter we'd received. "Listen to this," he said, his voice warm with pride. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Harrison, 6 months ago, my daughter and I hadn't spoken in 3 years because of a misunderstanding about my late husband's will. After a week at your center in Miami, we not only reconciled but planned a trip to Europe together. Thank you for showing us that love is stronger than pride." I leaned against his shoulder, thinking about how far we'd traveled from that day when I'd turned him away from the hotel lobby, from that moment of cruel judgment to this, building spaces where people could find their way back to each other. "You know what I realized," I said. "What's that?" "The best love stories aren't about perfect people finding each other. They're about imperfect people choosing to grow together, to forgive each other's pasts, and to build something beautiful from the broken pieces." Alexander kissed the top of my head. "Sounds like a pretty good foundation for a marriage. And a business," I added. "And a life," he finished. As I write this now, 5 years later, I think about all the families we've helped heal, all the conversations we've facilitated, all the relationships we've helped rebuild. But mostly, I think about the conversation Alexander and I have every night before we go to sleep. A simple check-in where we ask each other how we're really doing, what we're worried about, what we need from each other. It's a small thing, but it's everything. Because I learned that the deepest love isn't built on grand gestures or perfect moments. It's built on the courage to be honest about our imperfections, to face our family histories with clear eyes, and to choose each other not despite our complications, but because of how we handle them together. My name is Madison Thompson Harrison, and this is the story of how I learned that sometimes the most beautiful love grows in the spaces between our broken pieces, watered by truth and tended with forgiveness. Sometimes the very thing that threatens to destroy us becomes the foundation for something stronger than we ever imagined possible.